So, what on earth do I mean by this? No, not that. Please excuse my subconscious chorus. For some reason I feel the need to let them out because creativity is messy and I think I'm funny. No, I'm not discussing that. Theosophy jokes are so last year and Piet Mondrian bores me to tears. Now that's more interesting. Yeah, let's start there. So, during the 1950s and into the 60s, the CIA, working in conjunction with the Museum of Modern Art in New York, along with the Rockefeller family and many others, funded art exhibitions throughout Europe as a way to counter Russian cultural expansion. They picked artists and writers and musicians that they felt exemplified the freedom of the West without any particular political views as to be seen in the art. So they covertly funded the promotion of work by, among others, George Orwell, Jackson Pollock, John Cage and Dizzy Gillespie. This also led to a shift from Paris to New York as the centre of the art world. But I really want to use this as an excuse to talk about this picture from 1956's exhibition Modern Art in the United States. It's Andrew Wyatt's Christina's World, which, as you can see, shows a woman in a field looking at a house. And it's also one of the best known American paintings in the world. Hardly invisible art. But it is all about the unseen limits of disability, and the resolve to face them, as Christina Olsen suffered from the degenerative muscular disease Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease. And this was about the limits of her ability to move under her own power. Now, going back a bit, how do you make covert government power and surveillance visible through art? Trevor Paglen has been finding ways to answer this question for years, using a variety of methods, from lenses designed for astrophotography to let him shoot photos of secret bases such as Area 51 in Nevada from at a safe distance of about 18 miles, to cataloguing the patches of classified military units and photographing satellites in the night sky that astronomers know about, but no country will ever admit to having launched them. But these are physical things. How about something more immaterial? Could you, for instance, photograph the shame of dead people and institutional neglect? Looks like the chorus beat me to it. But it'll take a bit of explaining, so bear with me. David Mizell is a photographer who has spent a lot of the last 30 years looking at the environmental impact of the mining industry, using aerial photography to create these colourful and disturbingly beautiful images of polluted wastelands across America. But in the mid-2000s, he heard about a room in the Oregon State Hospital, the same asylum where they had filmed One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where they were storing about 3,500 individually numbered copper canisters, undergoing various levels of oxidation. We'll just take a minute to absorb the beauty of these images. Now I'll get on with spoiling things. Inside each of these canisters are the cremated remains of a patient at the asylum who died there. The remains are reacting with the copper casing after the room they were stored in flooded. The families of the patients did not want to collect the remains, and the institution's response was to hide the dead away in a room and leave the canisters to decay, 3 deep on pine shelves, with a water-stained book as the only way to tell anything about who these people had been. and nothing about why they had been abandoned by their families. The majority of the images in the project are these graphically powerful stark photographs of the cans against a black background, which individually I find utterly beautiful, but collectively gain an increasingly haunted feeling, which is only added to by supplementary images of the asylum in its decayed state. One of the most moving elements of the images for me is the way they managed to bring back some form of individuality to the former patients, which makes what happened next somewhat galling to me. In what was obviously meant to be a show of some sort of respect for the dead, the cans have now been placed into identical black boxes with just a number on the front to identify them. On the plus side, the publicity surrounding the project has led to over 100 of the deceased being reclaimed by family members, and helped raise funding to build modern mental health facilities, which were sorely needed. Now, speaking of disappearing personalities, in his memoirs, Bob Dylan mentions seeing the outlaw artist Robin Whitlaw when he was at a Bon Voyage party for Cisco Houston. This is somewhat unlikely, as the best information about Miss Whitlaw that can be found is in an article created by Ralph Rugoff for the LA Weekly at the start of April in 1994, which among other things tells us, to quote him, in 1967, Robin Whitlaw, a black conceptual artist, put herself up for sale in a New York gallery. At the time, that gesture alone would have raised a host of issues related to the history of slavery and the exploitation of black women, not to mention the artist's status in a consumer society. But Whitlaw offered herself up for sale not as a slave, but as a master. When no buyers came forward, one could only conclude that the people in the art world, for all their liberal posturing, were unwilling to let a black woman run their lives. End quote. Still, why am I telling you about a 30-year-old April Fool's joke? Well, Robin, in all her non-existence, had far more visibility than one of the best street photographers of the 20th century had during her lifetime. Thank you. Vivian Dorothy Meyer was an American photographer born in New York in 1926. She spent a lot of her childhood in rural France. Despite how that may sound, her early life was one of financial and familial insecurity. Having spent time working in a doll factory, and after spending a brief period after that in France to oversee the sale of the family farm, she came back to New York, and in 1951 she started working as a live-in nanny, which would provide her with a living for the next 40 years, working for various families in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. During her life, she took over 150,000 photographs. This body of work was almost entirely unknown before her death. Shortly before she died, the storage company where she was storing 8 tons of magazines, newspapers, photographs, undeveloped films, and other artifacts collected over her lifetime changed hands, and she failed to pay the storage fees. And so her life was auctioned off and scattered to the winds. Then shortly after her death in 2009, one of the buyers went a bit viral when he wondered if this is good photography, which it's not. It's incredible photography. Born of hours of hard work, learning the craft, and then applying it with curiosity, empathy, and humour. I'd love to spend an hour just talking about how much I think this, just how fucking brilliant I think this is. But there's a lot in the way that people have talked about Miss Meyer that irks me. So you'll have to listen to me talk about that instead. And I'm arguing against an Oscar-nominated documentary and a biography that was inspired by that film. So what annoys me is the way that both talk about her as if choosing to work as a nanny was somehow very unusual, mysterious, and wrong. When nearly every artist I know of has looked to find work that can both support them and give them the flexibility to create. For instance, Philip Glass expected to have a day job for his entire life. To quote him from a 2001 Guardian article, "I had gone to install a dishwasher in a loft in Soho. While working, I looked up to find Robert Hughes, the art critic of Time magazine, staring at me in disbelief. 'But you're Philip Glass! What are you doing here?' It was obvious that I was installing his dishwasher, and I told him that I would soon be finished. 'But you are an artist,' he protested. I explained that I was an artist, but that sometimes I was a plumber as well, and that he should go away and let me finish." End quote. So the idea that a job that can take you to many interesting places on family holidays, provided you with a roof over your head and the opportunity to practice your craft while you're doing your day job, seems bloody brilliant, actually. In part, it's a failure of the writer's imagination to understand how lack of money and connections, let alone how 1950s American society viewed working class women, would severely limit access to the spaces that could have enabled her to support herself through her art. They also completely failed to comprehend that she might not have wished to monetize her passion to that extent. If you're not working professionally, you can follow your own interests without the pressure of needing to worry if what you're doing has any commercial value. Then the biography takes the bold choice to start diagnosing her mental health, and goes further than the safe conclusion that she was a compulsive hoarder who had lost at least one job over her collection, to then go on and suggest that having a brother with schizophrenia meant that Miss Meyer also suffered from that condition. Which is a hell of a leap. The author then uses this as a way to inextricably bind her creative flair and artistic instincts to mental illness. This is a common trope that removes thought, passion, skill, and sheer hard work from the equation. The book, for example, decides to take the fact that there are images of death, crime, demolition, and rubbish amongst her portfolio to point to subconscious reflections of low self-esteem. If you look at the works of any street photographer of note working in any big city, you'll find the same sorts of images appearing. So this sort of armchair psychiatry just doesn't hold up unless you're willing to say an entire profession suffers from this malaise. And to then go on and suggest that photography is just a coping mechanism is profoundly insulting to Miss Meyer's craft. But looking at the lazy trope of the tortured artists in discussions of mental health and art, we can see where this narrative comes from and how it continues to this day. But here's the thing, mental illness, like all illness, makes art and everything else harder to do. The most it does is give you a different set of experiences to draw on in your work. But that's true of so many other things in life. Going back to Miss Meyer, if you want some actual truth instead of speculation, look at her art. It's the truth she spent her life creating, and it's glorious. Yeah, I think so. To end this, I'm going to talk about art that is invisible due to being part of an unfinished project. This is one of mine. Kate, the lady in the chair, suffered from ALS, which is one of those horrible degenerative diseases that means that today is the best day that you'll have left health-wise. And she was terrified of the day that she would no longer be able to do anything without the help of others. And I realised I've completely screwed this up because I forgot to tell you what the unfinished project was about, which is everyday fears. And teach me, I should learn to read. Anyway, I caught something. We weren't doing tests back in March 2020, which has left me with chronic fatigue syndrome, and therefore without the focus and energy needed to complete the rest of the project I had planned. Anyway,